I am Solomon, one of the most renowned kings in ancient Israel. People remember me as a king, a wise man, and the builder of the temple, believing that I was the wise ruler who led Israel to prosperity. But what if I told you that behind the wisdom and glory, there was also corruption, downfall, and the pain of straying from God? This is not just a story of glory and wealth, but also a tale of desire, power, and loss. In this video, I will reveal how I transformed from a devout young man into a king corrupted by power. Was it the unbounded power that led me astray, or was it the foreign princesses I married, especially the daughter of Pharaoh, that brought about my downfall? Or perhaps it was the countless political marriages and deals I made to secure my throne that ultimately consumed my soul. I was born into a complex and tumultuous environment, but my arrival brought joy to my father and peace to my mother. My birth was a moment of rare happiness for my father, King David, who had suffered the loss of several sons. For my mother, Bathsheba, my birth was even more significant. She had endured the pain of being distanced by my father after the sin they committed together, a sin that had caused him to favor other concubines over her. Yet, my mother's wisdom and understanding became a source of comfort to my father in his grief, and my birth gradually eased the tension in her life. Growing up, I sensed the unease and fear that often surrounded my mother. She carried the burden of our family's past, and I could see how it weighed on her. But what I admired most was her ability to remain composed and decisive in the face of adversity. Her strength and wisdom left a lasting impression on me, even as a child. She taught me the importance of patience, discernment, and the subtle art of navigating the complex world of royal politics. It was from her that I learned to master my emotions, to project strength even when feeling uncertain. These lessons would shape me as I grew, preparing me for the challenges that lay ahead as the heir to the throne. But even with her guidance, the pressures and temptations of power would eventually lead me down a path I could not have foreseen. As my father, David, grew older, the question of succession became increasingly pressing. Adonijah, my eldest brother, was considered by many to be the rightful heir to the throne. He was strong, charismatic, and had the backing of General Joab, who sought to maintain his influence in the kingdom after my father's death. Joab's alliance with Adonijah was not surprising, as it was a strategic move to secure his position. However, my mother, Bathsheba, was acutely aware of the shifting dynamics within the court. She noticed the unease in the prophet Nathan, who feared that if the military supported Adonijah, the prophetic voice would be overshadowed by the power of the sword. Nathan, who had always been a staunch advocate of divine guidance, found himself in a difficult position with no clear solution in sight. Understanding Nathan's predicament, my mother took a bold step. She reminded him of a conversation she had with David when I was born, where David had expressed his desire to make me king. This was a critical moment, for Nathan needed a legitimate reason to intervene in the succession. My mother's revelation provided him with the leverage he needed. At the crucial moment when Adonijah was about to declare himself king, Nathan advised my mother to approach David and remind him of his earlier intention to appoint me as his successor. My mother, with her wisdom and understanding of the delicate political situation, approached David and pleaded for my right to the throne. It was through her plea, combined with Nathan's influence, that I was hastily anointed as the next king of Israel. As soon as I ascended to the throne, it became clear that my first challenge would be dealing with those who had supported Adonijah's bid for power. My brother Adonijah, emboldened by his claim to the throne, was a threat I could not ignore. Despite the initial pardon I granted him, his continued attempts to undermine my rule forced me to take decisive action. I had no choice but to order his execution, ensuring that any potential rival to the throne was removed. General Joab, who had been a loyal servant to my father but had now aligned himself with Adonijah, also met a grim fate. His betrayal could not be overlooked, and though he sought refuge at the altar, I had him executed as well. These decisions were not easy, but they were necessary to secure my reign and prevent further instability in the kingdom. Although my ascension to the throne was fraught with the danger of clever maneuvers and intrigue, I couldn't help but admire my mother's ability to turn potential enemies into allies and her keen judgment in navigating the treacherous waters of royal politics. Yet this experience also planted a seed of doubt within me. I realized that even prophets, who were supposed to be the mouthpieces of God, were still human and could be swayed by their own interests. This understanding would later lead me to question and, at times, ignore the warnings of the prophets, setting the stage for my eventual downfall. Looking back, I came to realize that my position as king was not merely a result of chance, but a reflection of God's favor. My very birth carried profound significance. Not only was I the embodiment of my parents' hopes, but God Himself had named me Jedediah, meaning beloved of the Lord. I understood that my father's turbulent journey to the throne had been guided by God's promises, and now it was my turn to carry that legacy. When God appeared to me in a dream, offering me the chance to ask for anything, I felt the weight of my youth and inexperience pressing heavily upon me. I had ascended to the throne at a young age, and with that came an urgent need to prove that I was the rightful king of Israel. I knew that without demonstrating my capability, the way I handled the challenges left by my father's reign might be questioned. The pressure to establish my legitimacy was immense. I could have asked for wealth or power, but what I truly needed was the wisdom to govern this great nation. Only with divine guidance could I hope to lead Israel effectively and fulfill the expectations that had been placed upon me. So, I asked God for the wisdom to rule, knowing that my success as king depended entirely on His blessing. And God, in His mercy, granted me unparalleled wisdom, along with abundant wealth and honor. As time passed, it became clear that God had indeed granted me extraordinary wisdom. My judgments became renowned throughout the land, particularly in cases that others found impossible to resolve. One such instance was the dispute between two women claiming the same child, a case that tested not only my wisdom, but also my ability to discern truth in the most challenging circumstances. It was through these acts of wisdom that my reputation spread far beyond Israel's borders, giving me a significant advantage in diplomacy. This newfound status opened doors for Israel, including strategic marriages with powerful neighboring nations. These alliances not only secured our borders, but also brought in valuable trade opportunities. Among these was my marriage to Pharaoh's daughter, a union that promised both peace and prosperity for Israel. However, it was also at this point that my true test began. Pharaoh, seeking to ensure his daughter's comfort and influence, demanded that I provide her with luxurious living conditions, including the construction of a grand palace and temples for her worship. Faced with this demand, I chose to compromise. I believed that the security of Israel and the economic benefits of trade with Egypt were too important to jeopardize. The prospect of solidifying an alliance with such a powerful neighbor seemed worth the concessions. But when the prophet came to warn me about the dangers of allowing idolatry within Israel, I dismissed his concerns. I recalled how the prophet had once been motivated by the desire to protect his own influence, and I trusted in my God-given wisdom to navigate the complexities of foreign religions. Confident in my ability to manage these challenges, I rejected the prophet's warning, believing I could handle the situation on my own terms. In doing so, I unknowingly set the stage for my eventual downfall. The very wisdom that had brought me success now led me to overestimate my abilities, making compromises that would slowly erode my devotion to God. Despite the compromises I made, the benefits of my alliances, particularly with Egypt, were undeniable. Through these marriages, I was able to profit immensely from the trade of chariots and horses, earning a substantial margin by acting as a middleman between Egypt and other nations. This not only filled Israel's coffers, but also allowed me to amass a considerable number of horses, bolstering our military strength. The trade agreements with Egypt also brought in luxury materials for construction and interior decoration, enabling me to adorn the palaces with the finest wood, stone, and spices. These materials, along with other luxury goods like perfumes and exotic spices, elevated the splendor of Israel's architecture and culture to new heights. Israel's olive oil, spices, and wine found new markets in Egypt, creating profitable export opportunities that further enriched the kingdom. The success of my trade agreements with Egypt did not go unnoticed by other neighboring nations. As Israel's wealth and influence grew, so did the desire of these nations to secure their own interests and share in the prosperity we were building. Seeing the benefits that Egypt had reaped from our alliance, other kingdoms were quick to follow suit, offering their daughters in marriage as a means to cement political and economic ties with Israel. Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and even distant kingdoms like Sheba saw the advantage of aligning themselves with the burgeoning power of Israel. These nations, each with their own strategic interests, recognized that through marriage, they could secure favorable trade agreements, military alliances, and a measure of influence over Israel's policies. The political marriages I entered into were not merely symbolic gestures, but calculated moves by these nations to ensure their economic and political security. Each marriage brought with it not only a new bride, but also access to the resources, goods, and knowledge of her homeland. For instance, the alliance with Sidon provided Israel with expert craftsmen and luxury goods from the Phoenician trade networks, while the marriage to a princess of Moab facilitated the exchange of agricultural innovations and trade routes that benefited both nations. These alliances also helped to stabilize the region, as the interconnectedness of our economies made war less desirable and cooperation more profitable. However, this network of political marriages also came with its own challenges. Each wife brought with her the customs and religious practices of her homeland, and to maintain these delicate alliances, I found myself accommodating their traditions within Israel. Temples were built, and rituals were observed, not only to appease my wives, but also to honor the agreements that had been forged through these unions. What began as a strategy to secure Israel's borders and economic prosperity gradually turned into a web of compromises that would have far-reaching consequences for my kingdom. These marriages, while beneficial in many ways, also introduced foreign influences that began to erode the spiritual foundation of Israel. The once singular devotion to Yahweh became diluted with the worship of other gods. As my foreign wives sought to maintain their religious practices in their new home, this influx of diverse beliefs and practices slowly led Israel into a state of religious syncretism, where the worship of Yahweh was no longer exclusive, but mingled with the idols of the surrounding nations. Thus, the very alliances that were intended to strengthen Israel, economically and politically, also sowed the seeds of spiritual decline. The peace and prosperity we enjoyed came at a cost, as the integrity of our faith was compromised in the pursuit of worldly success. Culturally, the influence of not just Egyptian art and craftsmanship, but also the artistic traditions of neighboring nations began to permeate Israel. The Phoenicians, renowned for their skilled artisanship in wood, ivory, and textiles, contributed significantly to the adornment of our palaces and temples. From Moab and Edom came unique architectural designs and decorative elements, while the wealth of knowledge from the kingdom of Sheba introduced new techniques in jewelry making and incense crafting. I eagerly incorporated these diverse artistic styles into our own, gradually transforming Israel into a hub of cultural exchange. This amalgamation of influences not only enriched our own artistic traditions, but also positioned Israel as a beacon of cosmopolitan sophistication in the region. The splendor of our buildings, adorned with the finest materials and designs from across the known world, attracted visitors from distant lands, each eager to witness the grandeur of Israel's capital. As word of our cultural renaissance spread, Israel's international reputation soared, and our land became a destination for scholars, artisans, and traders alike, all drawn by the vibrant mix of cultures and the promise of prosperity. Yet, these economic and cultural advancements came at a spiritual cost. The wealth and prosperity that flowed from these alliances masked the fact that I had begun to turn a blind eye to God's commandments. The very trade in horses, which was so profitable, directly violated God's decree that the king should not accumulate many horses. Similarly, the temples I allowed to be built for my foreign wives led to the worship of other gods, further distancing Israel from the one true God. In my pursuit of international prestige and economic power, I overlooked the warnings of Scripture, convincing myself that the ends justified the means. But in doing so, I set aside the very commandments that were meant to guide and protect us, leading myself and Israel down a path of spiritual compromise. However, despite the compromises I made in other areas, I remained convinced that as king, I had to maintain my devotion to God, especially because I was entrusted with the sacred duty of building the temple. This was a responsibility I did not take lightly. My alliance with King Hiram of Tyre was instrumental in this endeavor. Through our collaboration, I secured the finest cedar and timber, as well as the skilled craftsmen needed to bring my vision to life. The construction of the temple progressed smoothly, thanks to this fruitful partnership. Maintaining a strong relationship with King Hiram also ensured that Israel received the necessary maritime support, which was crucial for our trade routes. Additionally, the cooperation between our nations allowed us to continually receive gold from the distant islands, further enhancing the grandeur of the temple. When the temple was finally completed, it was everything I had envisioned and more. Following my direction, gold was used wherever possible, creating a structure of unparalleled splendor that stood as a testament to Israel's wealth and my devotion to God. The people of Israel marveled at the magnificence of the temple and celebrated my wisdom, wealth, and piety. Yet, as the praises grew louder, I found myself increasingly absorbed in the admiration and splendor that surrounded me. The warnings of the prophets, which once resonated so strongly in my heart, began to fade into the background. The more I basked in the glory of what I had built, the less I heard the voices of those who cautioned me about the path I was treading. Gradually, I started to lose sight of the very principles that had guided me to this point, becoming enamored with the beautiful world I had created for myself. After completing my own luxurious palace, God appeared to me for the second time. He commended me for my dedication to the construction of the temple, acknowledging the effort and care I had put into ensuring it was a worthy dwelling place for His presence. However, this time, He also issued several stern warnings. When I awoke from the vision, I was drenched in cold sweat. The weight of His words lingered heavily on my mind. I spent a long time pondering how to prevent the people of Israel from falling into the danger of worshiping other gods. The dilemma was agonizing. If I tore down the temples dedicated to foreign deities, the foreigners who came to worship would be terrified and might avoid Israel altogether, which would jeopardize our trade relations. Additionally, my wives, especially the princesses who slept beside me, would be emotionally shattered by such an act. As I watched these intelligent and virtuous women carefully raising my children, I couldn't help but think of my mother and the days she spent by my father's side. I didn't want my children to live in fear because of their mother's circumstances. I loved my wives, and they brought me much joy, far more comfort than the constant arguments I endured with the prophets in the assembly. In the end, I reasoned that perhaps the best I could do was to guide the Israelites through my own example during worship. If my presence could bring them a sense of fulfillment and encourage them to follow the right path, maybe that would be enough to keep us all from straying too far. However, as time passed, the complexities of maintaining the kingdom's stability began to weigh heavily on me. After I established Rehoboam as my sole heir, solidifying Israel's strategic relationship with Ammon through his mother, I realized that to keep the peace with my other foreign wives, I needed to make concessions in areas they deeply valued. These women, who hailed from powerful nations like Egypt, Moab, and Sidon, had their own expectations and religious practices. To maintain their allegiance and prevent their families from interfering with the smooth succession of the throne, I began to participate in their religious ceremonies and offered blessings to their children. It started as a political necessity, a way to ensure that these women did not seek to influence the kingdom's affairs through the powerful forces behind them. Yet, in doing so, I found myself increasingly drawn into their world, attending their worship services, and allowing temples to be built for their gods on the sacred land of Israel. What began as a calculated move to preserve the kingdom's stability slowly led me down a path of compromise, where the lines between political pragmatism and spiritual integrity became blurred. My involvement in these foreign rituals did more than just placate my wives. It also set a dangerous precedent for the people of Israel. Seeing their king participate in the worship of foreign gods, they too began to adopt these practices, leading Israel into a deepening syncretism, where the worship of Yahweh became mixed with the idolatry of surrounding nations. My actions, meant to safeguard the kingdom, instead led my people into spiritual confusion, drawing them away from the true worship of God. Although I knew deep down that these compromises were against God's will, I found myself unable to see a better way out of the complex situation I faced. In an effort to maintain stability and consolidate power, I gradually became entangled in the practices of mixed worship. I was aware that I was straying from the right path, yet I couldn't escape the web of compromises I had woven. As time went on, the influence of these foreign beliefs caused me to lose my focus on the pure worship of God. I once thought that compromise and adaptation were the marks of wisdom necessary to rule a kingdom, but in truth, I was deceiving myself and gradually losing my sense of identity. I was no longer the king who wholeheartedly revered Yahweh. Instead, I became increasingly lost in the fog of polytheism, unable to distinguish true faith from the falsehoods of idolatry. What had once been my strength and wisdom had now become the very source of my downfall. Now, in the twilight of my life, I am crushed by the weight of my regrets. The prophet came to me, delivering a devastating message. The kingdom of Israel would be torn apart because of my disobedience, with only a small remnant left for my descendants. The fear gripped my heart as I realized the full extent of my failure. In my desperation, I sought to eliminate Jeroboam, whom the prophet had identified as the one who would take the kingdom from my son. But even this act of aggression could not undo the damage I had done. I always wanted to be a good king, to rule with wisdom and justice, but in my attempts to secure power and maintain alliances, I compromised the very principles that should have guided me. My desire to please those around me, to build a prosperous kingdom, blinded me to the path of true righteousness. In my youth, I believed that wisdom, wealth, and power could bring true fulfillment. But now, I see that all my efforts were in vain. As I reflect on the words I later penned in Ecclesiastes, I realize the futility of amassing wealth, for who knows whether the one who inherits it will be wise or foolish. I now understand that my compromises, my neglect of God's commands, led to a kingdom built on shaky foundations. The wealth I gathered, the alliances I forged, none of it could secure the future I envisioned for Israel. My greatest mistake was believing that I could selectively follow God's commandments while still being a good king. The truth is, true wisdom lies in fully obeying God's commands without compromise, for this is the duty of all mankind. I overlooked this simple yet profound truth in my pursuit of worldly success, thinking I could balance the demands of power with my own desires. Now, I must face the consequences of those compromises. As I reflect on all that I have learned, I now understand that the pursuits of this world, wisdom, wealth, pleasure, and toil, are ultimately meaningless without God. Life under the sun is full of vanity. Everything we strive for is but a fleeting vapor, quickly passing and leaving no lasting fulfillment. I once sought satisfaction in accumulating knowledge and riches, but these only brought more sorrow and disillusionment. For with much wisdom comes much vexation, and increasing knowledge only increases grief. I see now that life is full of uncertainties and contradictions. The righteous may suffer while the wicked prosper, and all our efforts can be undone in an instant. What's more, all that we build, all the wealth we amass, we must leave behind to others, without knowing whether they will be wise or foolish. This truth leaves our labors feeling empty, as we cannot control what happens after we are gone. Yet, even in this vanity, there is a lesson to be learned. In the midst of life's fleeting nature, we are to find joy in the simple gifts God provides, in our food, our drink, and the work He has given us to do. These are the moments of true contentment, fleeting though they may be. Above all, I have come to realize that the only true wisdom is to fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of mankind. All our earthly pursuits are in vain if they do not align with this divine purpose. Everything will be brought to light and judged by God, whether good or evil. It is only by walking in His ways that we find true fulfillment and peace, something I wish I had fully embraced from the start. In the final moments of my life, as I held my son Rehoboam's hand, my heart was heavy with pain. I couldn't help but think of my father David, who, when he passed, left me a unified kingdom, a nation that was orderly in every respect, especially in its pure devotion to God. But now, as I prepared to pass the throne to Rehoboam, I was struck by the stark contrast. I was leaving him a kingdom that was fractured, where wealth had been amassed at the cost of spiritual integrity. Idol worship was rampant, and our enemies surrounded us on all sides. The years I spent building grand palaces and temples had come at a great cost, burdening the people with heavy taxes and fueling their resentment. The kingdom I was handing over was one where discontent brewed, a far cry from the flourishing nation my father had entrusted to me. I wanted so desperately to leave something of value for my son, something that could guide him in the difficult years to come. But as I stood there, all I had to offer him were the words I had failed to live by myself, to keep God's commandments. And as I spoke these words, I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes, for I knew that they were all I had left to give. My tears and a hope that Rehoboam might succeed where I had failed. As I lay on my deathbed, with life drawing to an end, Rehoboam sat by my side. With the last of my strength, I completed one of my most important works, a psalm, as a final lesson to my son. Unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the guards stand watch in vain. I turned to Rehoboam, reminding him of the vital importance of reverence for God. I urged him to keep this in his heart, for true wisdom and strength come only from walking in the fear of the Lord. As I finished the psalm, my thoughts turned to my father David. I had always admired him deeply, for he never compromised on God's commandments. His unwavering faith and devotion were the foundation of his success as king, and I could not help but feel a profound sense of respect for the life he led. Do not miss the story of David, the man who never wavered in his commitment to God. If this video has helped you in any way, then click that like button and check out some of our other videos that should be showing on the screen right now. Thank you.